Well, welcome back. We have a very interesting panel. I always like the old-fashioned Darwinian look at evolution where they talk about random variation and mutation, and I think those are really essential parts of imagination too. Never knowing what the possibility is going to bring next when you bring together an inclusive group of people, and this certainly is it. It's my luxury to introduce your moderator for the panel conversation, Lance Elliott. Lance Elliott is go ahead. He is a highly successful business leader and entrepreneur. He has started up 3 startup companies, run them, and sold them successfully. Today, he is a senior advisor to the vice chair of the Congressional Committee on Science and Technology in this country. He also was a former professor of engineering at USC. He holds an MBA as well as a PhD in computer sciences and what's the other word? Business, yes. I knew there was another word I was missing. And as well, he has served on so many volunteer communities throughout the region and also at USC, especially, and I think this is essential today, encouraging young women to enter related fields to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as they take their place in leadership positions in the world today and tomorrow. He is also the author, and believe it or not, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 books here, and you know, he wrote them all this past year? I mean, it's unbelievable. Innovation and Thought, Leadership on Self-Driverless Cars, for example. Being a pivot-wise business leader, and this speaks to what Alex was talking about. How do you start up a company when the nature of the game is changing within years? You know, from the time you started up to the time it's running, it's changed already again. As well as innovation, thought, leadership on self-driving, driverless cars. And moreover, how to win a startup pitch competition. And when I made a derogatory comment about this title, about profit, he said most of the startups today, and it speaks to the value of millennials, have an underlying social value attached to them, both in giving back economically as well as in principles relative to sustaining this world. So with that in mind, I am pleased to give these books back to him and turn this over to Lance.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So one thing that I wanted to start with is I grew up in this area, in the Los Alamitos, Rossmore area, and as a child came to the Rancho many times. And furthermore, my own children, in raising them here in this area, have brought them to the Rancho many times as well. In fact, they would be here today, except for my son is a student at UC Berkeley, majoring in computer science, and they're just going through the midterms now, so he's kind of focused on that, which makes sense to me that he should focus on his academics. And my daughter, who graduated from USC last year, speaking of the STEM topic, she actually works as a digital marketing analyst for a company up in the Bay Area, and she combines kind of the marketing aspects, consumer behavior, and the technology aspects. And when she was young, what I saw right away was some of the unfortunate bias against females going into a technology area. And I assure you, it infuriated me as a proud father of my daughter to see that happen. And so since then, I've tried to do what I can in volunteering for various community groups, STEM activities, to find ways to encourage women, females, to go into the technology fields. So anyway, I'm very honored to be here today, given my history with the Rancho, and very excited that I should be invited here to speak today at this event. So thank you for that. Well, we have quite a panel assembled, and what I'd like to do is introduce to you each of the panel members. I'll go from my right across this way to my left and introduce briefly each of the panel members. Once I've done that, we have a short video clip that was put together by one of the panel members that we'll take a look at, and then we'll enter into a moderated forum where I have various questions to ask them and see what their thoughts are. And some of those questions you'll see right away tie into what Alex had said, giving the panelists opportunity to react, respond, and add additional thoughts to some of the commentary that Alex already has provided to us. With that, I'll start with Alan at my far right. He's founder and senior principal of Studio 111, an integrated practice of architecture, landscape, and urban design located in Long Beach and Los Angeles. With over 20 years of award-winning experience, he leads teams for mixed-use, urban infill, and adaptive reuse projects, including the revitalization of the Block in downtown Los Angeles. And any of you that have been to downtown Los Angeles, you've no doubt seen the massive construction effort taking place there for the Block. And you may also, for those of you that have attended this series before, Wayne Radovich was a speaker here previously, and that's his project, which he talked about there, which now gradually has reached to fruition. He also serves on the Urban Land Institute's Urban Revitalization Council and the board of Downtown Long Beach Alliance. He is also a current participant in the London School of Economics Executive Masters in Cities program for global urban professionals. Please help me welcome Alan to the panel. Now, Alex, you already know all about, so Alex, I'll continue on here on the panel. Alenda is assistant professor of film and media studies at UC Santa Barbara. In fact, she drove down today from Santa Barbara. Thank you so much for doing that. Specializing in environmental and digital media. Her forthcoming book, Playing Nature, develops ecological frameworks for understanding and creating greener games, and at UCSB, she co-founded Wireframe, a new digital media studio supporting media art and activism and critical game design. She helped produce AirQuest, a civic action game about asthma and air quality in the California Central Valley, and is currently at work on Corridors, a game about modifying human infrastructure to mitigate habitat fragmentation. Please help me welcome Alenda to the panel. Next to my left here is Jeff. Jeff is an assistant professor, interactive media and games division at USC. So we're essentially fellow Trojans up here. An award-winning artist and designer. His work investigates how game design, pervasive computing, and social media can enable new forms of storytelling, participation, and learning. His design work has been commissioned for institutions and companies, including Intel, BMW, Boeing, Take Action Games, the Institute for Multimedia Literacy, and more. He has presented work and spoken at festivals and conferences such as the Berlin International Film Festival, the Game Developers Conference, and shown work at exhibitions at the Hammer Museum and the Museum of Moving Image. Please help me welcome Jeff to the panel. Now, before I introduce our final panelist on the panel here, my son, I mentioned, is a student at UC Berkeley. This last summer, he got an internship, and he was an intern for Blizzard Activision, which is a well-known gaming company. So, Jeff, he'll be excited to know that we've had a chance to chat. But we also have here on the panel someone, going back to Alex's comments earlier about multi-generational. We have added to the panel today Jessie here on my far left, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. She's a sophomore and the Dean Scholar at Chapman University in the School of Business and Economics with an interest in message communication. An active community volunteer, she has created a bilingual coloring book, The Aussie Team, designed for children with broken bones who have come to the Urgent Care Center at the Los Angeles Orthopedic Institute for Children in order to explain the medical process leading to their cast. She served as a summer intern to the Conversations in Place 2017 series, so we thank her for her contribution to the series, and successfully designed and implemented the social media project reaching out to millennials at 5 universities, including CSULB, UCLA, USC, Chapman, and Fullerton. Please help me welcome Jessie to the panel. Okay, I had promised that after the introductions of the panel members, we'd see a short video. This is a video that Alenda has put together. Do you have any comments to kind of get us set up for the video?
Yeah, so actually, the company Strange Loop Games, which is based out of Seattle, put the video together for PAX last year, and so I'm just borrowing it, but it's a game that I write about in my forthcoming book, and if you've ever heard of the game Minecraft, or your grandkids or kids have told you about it. Imagine this as a sustainable form of Minecraft, and I wanted to put it out there as an example of world building and sort of imagining alternatives for a better future.
And before we show the video, I would also ask my fellow panel members, after the video is shown, I'll ask you if you have any comments, thoughts, or reaction to the video that you've seen. So please take a look. And with that, I think we're ready for the video to be shown.
So that game is actually currently still in alpha development, but I believe you can get access to it. It started as a Kickstarter-funded project, and then has now been supported by the Department of Education, and they are playtesting it in middle schools and finding out some interesting things about how kids actually use the game, not often to the purposes for which it was built. But that's part of the spirit of play. But I think it's a good example maybe to begin the conversation about the urgency of the matters in front of us, and where if play has a role in addressing that, and if so, what that would be. And in my own work, thinking about how oftentimes we're encouraged to see nature and technology as mutually exclusive realms. And I just don't find that a productive place to start from. And the game forces you to take action. It obliquely references it by saying an external influence, but essentially 100 days after the server is started, a meteor will crash into the world and destroy it unless you have researched appropriate technology to stave off that end. So there's doing nothing is not a winning choice either. So I think maybe we could get other comments, but.
Great, thank you very much for that. Yeah. So would any of the panelists, Jeff, do you have any comments or thoughts you'd like to make?
Yeah, I think, strangely, I was reminded of Monopoly when I was watching this, and I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but Monopoly was actually originally created, even as we've come to very much associate it with almost a celebration of capitalism. It was actually originally created as a critique. And I think we all know from our, dreadful evenings of playing Monopoly that the game is kind of fun at the beginning when everybody's sort of on the same level, but very quickly a monopoly forms, right? And then like dad just spends the rest of the game collecting money from the rest of the family, and maybe, the little brother leaves the table altogether. So, I think the choices that we can make in games constitute almost like rehearsals for things in real life, which is what can give games their critical power. I think that was some of the original thinking behind Monopoly, which was created by a woman named Elizabeth McGee to support a socialist movement in the early 20th century, weirdly, and then it was bought by Parker Brothers or whoever distributed it. But I think with games like this, we offer players different kinds of rehearsals, and we allow them to see different kinds of systems and to experience them and to come to greater understandings about themselves and the systems that they're confronting. So yeah, I'm personally really excited to play this game.
And I should say I've had the opportunity to interview the CEO of this company, who founded the company straight out of undergraduate as a CS major at University of Washington. So I spoke to him this summer, and I think he, in testing this in middle schools, he determined that some of the students just had a glorious time destroying the environment to build really lovely structures, but in a way that was educational in its own way about what happened when they took from the environment. But for me, because I've studied games from this ecological angle for many years now, it's really refreshing to see a game that actually models the interconnection that Claudia was talking about in her opening remarks with the John Muir quote. So in Minecraft, when you mine, there are no really negative consequences other than maybe zombies popping up from underneath the play world. But here you actually produce mine tailings, and the mine tailings can pollute the water table, and the water table then affects the crops that are growing from that. I've also written about farm games, so some of you may have heard of a casual game called Farmville, which sucked up many hours of my time. And it always infuriated me to no end that when you played Farmville, the original, that you didn't have to water your crops, which just seems like a very basic principle of tending plants. I think I'm offering eco not necessarily as the solution, but as an example of how we can design and imagine more fruitful ways of being. And I think it goes back to affect as well. So this is something where I think with environmentalism, we're often, the emotion of environmentalism is a feeling of being scolded or feeling that you're not doing enough, or there's a lot of sort of fear and sorrow and maybe even grieving for a way of life that's going. And that games may offer a different affect or a different relation to these problems that kind of frees us from being paralyzed by the enormity of what's happening in front of us, especially for younger generations where they've kind of grown up with this as the constant refrain. And the easy thing is just sort of just turn off and not do anything, or sort of just grieve. And this is actually about taking action and doing something.
Well, so speaking of younger generations, how about we'll go to Jesse to see, do you have any thoughts or reaction to the video or what you saw and what you've heard so far?
I think it's an interesting point about turning away, because I think as a generation, we're so much emphasis is put on visuals, and with social media, we're constantly looking at our phones. It's really a lifestyle now and not entertainment. And so by using games and something that these kids do every day to change how they look at the world and to see their position, I think that's crucial, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Thank you very much. And I don't want to leave out the bright side over here. So Alan, did you have any comments or reaction to the video?
Well, at first it was interesting because it looked like it was a purely natural world. There was this narrative in there. It started with just purely natural world, and you talked about, you showed animals eating. Reproduction was shown by pictures of bunnies, which I thought was really, I was like, oh, that's smart, bunny. But then as it went, you started to introduce humans, and all of a sudden you start rudimentary buildings, and by the end you had cities in the natural world, and I thought that was interesting. And I think we're always thinking, so architects are using computer technology, a lot of it from gaming, to model buildings so we could figure out what they could actually look like. And we have this thing called parametric design now, which is not only what they look like, but how they'll function, what energy they'll need, and how certain different parameters of the building, how much brick we'll need, and can we reduce that and get it more efficient. So we're using computers in certain ways on the buildings. But as an urban designer, what I'm really interested in gaming, we talked about this a little bit earlier, how can we use something that actually starts to predict some of the outcomes of some of the decisions? And that's the most interesting thing, because I think we know generally at a very large regional what we need to do to make to grow more sustainably. But it comes down to, but that's a scale issue, because big and over long periods of time don't really relate to people having to make a decision at the local level, at the neighborhood level, at the block level, your neighbor. And how can we use gaming, and something we talk about a lot, to make people think about the implications? And just to tie it back to what Alex said, I think the thing he said that was so interesting to me was, being a better ancestor. And that's very noble, but it's hard to do. I think we have to figure out ways that make it easier for people to make the decisions now that will affect generations in the future. And maybe gaming could be part of that. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you very much. And Alex, so you're welcome to react to the video and also even your own remarks from earlier before, if you'd like.
No, let's leave those aside. No, actually, I'm fascinated by this topic because actually, of the 4 projects I'm working on now, 3 have gaming tie-ins. And there's a reason for that, which is that much of the kind of storytelling that we need to do to connect people emotionally to long-term things and big systems things, sort of system storytelling, is inherently difficult to do with a single point of view in a linear way beginning from now. And that actually games, one of the things they do incredibly well is teach us a system. Right, so Monopoly, right? That system might always end with dad owning everything until finally you give up and kick the game. That was not from personal experience. But it does teach you along the way some lessons about what that system is, right? It is a system inclined towards monopoly. And similarly, there are a lot of really great video games, VR experiences, board games, even sort of live action role-playing stuff, where the point of it is to engage with other people in the system. So I think there's a really rich ground here, and there's lots to talk about. I will note that I'm glad that this is more optimistic, except for the giant zygotic meteor headed at the planet, than another thing that I explored, which is I wrote a little short story a couple years ago, some science fiction about gaming. You can read it if you want. It's called This Earthly Sphere. It's easy to find online. But the point of that was basically that unless you really got into the system much more deeply than most gamers would engage, that it always ended badly. So, like, I'm glad to see that when actually dealing with children, we're not dooming them immediately to despair about the future.
Well, thank you very much, panel, for reacting to that. I think I'll stick with the game topic for the moment, and I'll bring up something that has a little bit of controversy to it, and we'll see how the panel reacts. There is a trend now towards what many people are calling gamification. And what this refers to is taking almost everything around us and in some way embedding within it a game aspect in order to get someone to be interested in it. And let me give you an example. I'm sure that many of us grew up and we maybe dissected frogs when we were in school. Then they went to the digital dissection where you didn't dissect an actual frog, it's one on the screen. But now what they do is they make it into a game for the kids where they have to try to dissect the frog and earn points and try to do it on a time basis or accuracy basis, trying to make them more interested in the nature of that activity by gamifying it. And this is even in industry as well. What you see in industry, many of the companies that I work with, they're using gamification for even simple things like a clerk who does accounts payable or accounts receivable. They have the software turn that into kind of a game to entice the worker to really use it and try to get up their efficiency and effectiveness. So one of the questions that some are asking, and so this is now the question I'll ask to the panel is this gamification taking us too far? Is it, in a sense, a crutch for those of us that would think that we're independent thinkers, that now we have to have all around us these games in order to cause us to engage and to become involved in something? And so with that, Jeff, it looks like you're eager to speak on that.
Yes, I'm itching to jump on the gamification topic. I was reminded there of another sort of archaic thing, I guess like New York City patrol cop key thing. I don't know if I just remember this from reading about it somewhere. I guess turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, beat cops in New York City would have particular routes that they would have to travel. And at various stops along the routes, they would have to open a little box and flip a little switch that would show that they covered that part of their route. And it was a way for the police station to monitor and make sure that their police were doing their routes. And so they could go to the box and say, hey, you weren't there that night. We caught you. And so I think gamification offers a kind of a very granular form of surveillance to educators and to people running companies and to governments. I direct you towards thinking about some of what's going on. Some of this is apocryphal, but there's been some reporting on this that's pretty accurate about the effectively equivalent of the credit rating system in China, equivalent to our credit score system. And this system, if you think about your credit score here, it's kind of like a little points system, right? Like if you're a good consumer and you're a good financial person and you pay your bills on time, your credit score goes up. Well, they have a similar system in China, but they also work in demerits to your score if you, for example, post anti-government commentary on the internet, right? So I think those are some of the risks around gamification, that it can be used as a kind of surveillance tool, because the thing is, play is deep within us, right? Like those chickens out there like to play. It's something that is, transcends our humanity, and it is just part of our becoming constantly. And so when you work with play and when you design play, you actually wield a lot of power because people want to do it. And so you can use these gamification techniques to kind of also do behavioral modification. And so I think, while there are a lot of opportunities for increasing the efficiencies of businesses, I think that largely that's what gamification is about. That it's not actually about exalting play, but it's about putting play to a very particular use that may not wholly be in the interest of the player themselves.
Great, thank you for that. And Linda, I'll ask you kind of your comments, but before we get to that, I'm pretty sure the chickens are actually listening to us right now. So watch out when you leave. These chickens are going to be pretty informed. Did you have any reaction to the gamification topic?
Yeah, I think maybe just to do the flip side, because I believe all of those things about gamification and the kind of co-opting the spirit of play for operational ends. I think no amount of achievements or badges will make stocking an inventory room fun. But but we all participate in these kinds of practices. If you have a loyalty card to your local coffee chain or a rewards card at your grocery store, you're already participating in these systems of gamification. And there have been people who have likened games to essentially Skinner boxes, the sort of psychological equivalent of us sort of hitting a lever for randomized rewards, which makes it so addictive. But I always do trend optimistic. And I think the reason why there's so much excitement about game mechanics is because there is something powerful about unstructured play with guidance, with information that's delivered at the appropriate time, and tangible rewards and benefits and understandings. And this is part of the power of a game experience, right? So we just must use our powers for good and not evil.
I'll continue this way. Alex, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that gamification and games are not actually the same thing. That one is a inherently pleasurable collecting activity, and one is play, and that those are not actually the same thing. I think that there are tremendously powerful opportunities for doing good things when we kind of get at what makes people respond, most frequently, most enthusiastically, et cetera. But I also see a lot of these things as beginning to be sort of, fitness faking technologies where we're hardwired to respond to things. And so when they're presented to us, we respond to them. And they may not actually be fulfilling the need that we are hardwired to have. There's a lot of evidence that if you use social media to the exclusion of face-to-face friends, that your mental health deteriorates, right? We're seeing this with a lot of younger people, skyrocketing rates of depression, anxiety. Well, because seeing your friend post a picture is not the same thing as being with your friend in all sorts of ways, and that it's great to have a friendship that also has social media components, but at a certain point you start to lose the core of the thing. And I think that it's the real danger of right now, in terms of so much of what's happening on the internet, are these things that are well designed by incredibly smart people using incredible amounts of data to make you do something. And that thing is almost always not in your long-term best interest, right? Or not your highest purpose. And that more and more it's about getting you to do something which gives them data and gives them asymmetric ability to influence you, because they know so much about you and you know nothing about what they're doing with the data. So I think there's a real danger built into some of these technologies that's worth us paying attention to now, so that we actually get the benefits without maybe all of the downsides of a surveillance dystopia.
Great. Thank you very much. And Alan, did you have any thoughts on this gamification topic or any of the other responses to that?
Well, I don't really know much about gamification, except that it seems that it is hardwired to us, and something's working about it. That's why it's probably growing. Is any kind of contest gamification? It's a question really for Jeff. Is competition part of gamification, and is it inherent in the way our brains are wired to respond to that?
Well, I have an answer, and I also have a relevant image, if we could put the relevant image on the screen. Yes, here it comes. So first I would say that, yes, I would agree with what Alex said earlier, that games and gamification are very different things. And I think we can sort of extend this conversation a bit looking at this painting from the Bosch studio, 16th century painting of a street magician. This is called The Conjurer. And you can see the magician has arranged a game here for the player to play. And the player is quite, focused on the game, right? And as many of you probably already noticed, it is kind of at his own expense that he is so engrossed in the game. If you look behind him, his pocket is being picked, right? And I think this is the power, the sort of evil power that we may use technologies that frame play, right? That people are so genuinely drawn to play experiences. It is such a deep core thing about us to want to play. I truly believe that play is at the heart of all invention, going back to the discussions around innovation. How did people come up with the idea to smoke tobacco? Like, just light that on fire and breathe it in. Like that seems like that might have started in a playful moment. Maybe not the best thing to do, right? But other kinds of inventions you can think, and you speak to scientists. My sister's a scientist, and I speak to her a fair bit about this and how she conceives of her work as play, in that she sort of sets up a laboratory context for herself and plays with the possibilities in there and discovers new things that way. But play can also be very organized by others to sort of tickle that desire that we have to play. To rip us off, or even not to rip us off, right? Like this is a very kind of direct equation here, right? The player, and you can't really see it so clearly, but there's actually frogs falling out of the player's mouth. And in the woodcut versions of this, the player is actually drooling. The player has been reduced to this sort of insensate participant, and that reduction allows him to be robbed. But it can also, actually treat the player very well. I think of many of my play practices using computers, and often I feel like I'm playing games that are a little bit like the game that we watched on the screen earlier, like a game that has a very kind of positive and constructive message to it, allows me to explore ideas and simulate outcomes in a really interesting way. But then at the same time, that play is also actually making money for large international resource extraction corporations that underwrite the technology industries, for example. So it's always a complicated thing when we design play and situate play in public space. And I think in some ways that's what gamification ends up touching on.
Thank you. And Alan, if that doesn't answer your question, then after the panel, the two of you can arm wrestle or continue the dialogue on that. Now, I don't want to forget Jesse in this. So Jesse, you in a sense represent the millennials, many of whom this gamification supposedly is trying to target. Any reaction to this topic or anything you've heard so far of the panel on that?
I think in an educational sense, in schools, the use of gamification is definitely trying to target young kids' need for motivation. I think a lot of older generations don't know how to catch kids' interest anymore, and they're doing anything possible to try to do that, to try to teach them the skills they think necessary to go out into the world. But I think there's a danger to it because kids are so used to instant gratification that the whole idea of winning something instantaneously, once they go into the real world and are working jobs, companies are they're trying to decide if they're loyal, and the general sense is that millennials and the generations after are not loyal. And so I think that's a part of the problem, and I think that's one of the dangerous sides of it.
Thank you very much. So kind of continuing on the game topic, but we're going to expand it a little bit and tie it to some of the remarks that Alex made earlier. So one is, Alex, you'd come about kind of the not invented here syndrome and the effects it has on the adoption and how cultures are more or less willing to adopt something depending on whether they feel that it was something invented in their own space, and also the snap forward topic, and also talk a little bit about international. Well, if you look at the game marketplace here in the US, predominantly most of the games that are here in the US are US developed games and culturally shaped by game developers who have that mindset. One of the questions I'll pose to the panel is, are we too narrow in our thinking? Should we be looking at and playing games from other countries that embed other cultures into them? And also, is there even a danger to that? Alex, your comment about did the Russians influence the election or not? If we were to see games that flooded into the US, would we be worried that maybe culturally it's going to shift our culture because it's a game developed in some other country that has cultures maybe that we don't agree with? So with that, kind of shaping that around a lot of the topics that were touched upon, I'll see, Alinda, do you have any comments on that?
I would just say that there are actually many games now that I think we tend to think of as being based here, but are actually coming from Japan, a lot of East Asian sort of contexts, and even popular ones like for the mobile market, like Heyday, or are actually produced in Scandinavia. And so you have to look very carefully at the fine print now to see where these things are being developed. And a lot of a lot of sort of game workshops or small studios are in Eastern Europe or places you wouldn't expect at first. But the games are usually culturally localized and linguistically localized by the time they get to us, and so we forget that we lose that opportunity. But I do think there is a potential ecological and sort of social lesson there. For farm games, for instance, I've played games that came from China and from Russia and Japan, and so instead of creating I don't know, I'm thinking coleslaw or something like that, you would make your own kimchi in your factory. And the Chinese game Happy Farm was linked to another game called Happy Factory, so you could export your products from your farm directly to the factory for making things. So I think that's kind of a fascinating opportunity there.
And Alex, in addition to addressing that, also I know that there was some that had wanted to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on Snap Forward or Snap Point in the mix of that.
Yeah. Well, so I'll just start straight in with the Snap Forward. So Snap Forward is, in its simplest form, the idea that there are large sectors in which progress has been delayed for political reasons or for reasons of technology diffusion and barriers to that, or other things which are external to the nature of what's going on in that industry. And where the progress in those industries is rapidly increasing and increasing in pace. And so that you have these situations where things are getting much, much better, and there's also suppressed demand, right? So, an example for this is electric cars, right? Where not only are electric cars getting incredibly better every year, but also many people who would buy them today, who say they would buy them today, do not have access to them because of regulatory barriers. There's, for instance, I think it's something roughly like 30 states in the US don't allow Tesla to have a showroom there. So you literally can't buy a Tesla in those states because you can only buy it from the showroom. So, for instance, right? And when you have situations, all political limits are brittle, right? Because sooner or later the politics changes that's holding that barrier up, and the barrier falls. And when you have a case of mounting pressure, of mounting torque, and a brittle barrier, like, you're in position to see change that is discontinuous from our current expectations. And my thesis in the Snap Forward is that we actually, so I look at 20 different sectors that I think that this is going on in. And when you add them all together, and you add the fact that these political barriers are not just neutral, but in fact things that literally hundreds of millions of people are trying to bring down, right? Then you see that the chances are good that we may see progress much more quickly than progress unfold much more quickly than we're used to expecting, but also that the impacts of that progress itself are going to be disruptive to our communities, to our jobs, to our nations, and shift the balance of economic power and all sorts of other things. So it's good news with a but,
And before I go to Alan and Jesse, I want to make sure that they're able to respond to that. In terms of time, we're getting close to the conclusion of this, so I'm going to ask actually one more question of the panel, and then after we've done a round of that, it'll probably be about time for me to hand the meeting back over to Claudia. And that question is, Alex, at the end of your presentation, one of the things that you kind of challenged us to think about was imagination, and the importance of imagination as a driver towards our future, towards what we might do next. And when you look at these games, you can conceive of that as a way to codify imagination. In other words, Alenda, the game that you have creates an imagination of a situation or a circumstance in which there's a sustainability and so on. So what I'd like to ask the panel is, what do you see in terms of games as a means to foster, create this kind of imagination and help us shape the future for those of us at all age levels and all generations? Any reaction that you have to games as that link to imagination and fostering imagination. And with that, since they didn't get a chance to respond to the other question, I'll start, Alan, if you have any thoughts on that.
I think imagination is important, but I don't know what you think about this, Alex. I think optimism is also important in the sense that there can be a great amount of inertia and even cynicism that we can make things better. The technology will make things better, or that change will end up being a good thing. I think you talked about this a little bit in your talk, that there could be a sense that, I don't know if it's nostalgia, but it's a sense that let's not change anything because it may have a negative impact. And I think we really need to kind of regain, and California is a good place to do this, regain this sense that change can be a positive, that can make a better life, not just for us in the short term, but for future generations. And so I would say that maybe gaming has the ability to open up some of those about possibilities and seeing positive outcomes down the road. That would be at least my hope for what some of these things that we're talking about, some of these technologies would be about, is creating the optimism that changes can be a positive in the future.
Well, I appreciate that, because I definitely want to have as our last comment something that's uplifting rather than negative. So, Jesse, I skipped you before, but I want to come to you. So any thoughts on this idea of imagination, gaming, and now we've had added to that list optimism?
I think imagination, and with gaming, not even just the content of games, but the creation of new games every day, every instance, creates optimism. I think in the generations that play these games, and they're ever changing, think they have the power to do the same. They think every day they have the power and the knowledge to create something new, and something that can change the world and change society as they know it. And so I think that's a great asset.
And Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, the games I've been making most recently, we've been calling them imagination games, and they are actually just card games. We haven't been using computers much for this set of projects, and we've made a game, if you would like to buy it, called The Thing from the Future. It's a great Christmas gift. And it's basically a card game that challenges you to think about the future or futures, all the possible futures that await us in different ways, by sort of throwing creative prompts your way that maybe don't comport with exactly how you always automatically imagine the future. Like when I imagine the future, I tend to imagine like Blade Runner, like it's horrible and there's like acid rain and, you know, robots running amok and stuff like that. I like to be challenged to, for example, think optimistically. That pushes me out of my default mode and pushes me into a space where I can maybe contemplate the future and the world in different ways. And I think games have this unique ability to do that to us, to provide us with an opportunity to perform in ways that we wouldn't normally perform. The last thing I'll say about this is, think of golf. Right? The goal of golf is put the ball in the hole at the other end of the green or of the course, the hole, or what. I don't golf, as you can tell. But golf would be less interesting if you could just carry the ball to the hole, right? The fact that you have to do it swinging these clubs, that's what actually forces you to be imaginative about this task of moving the ball forward. So I think games can kind of crack open the imagination in that way, and I think can be very useful for imagining our futures in new ways, which I think we have to radically do in this era of such complex challenges.
Thank you, Jeff. And I was going to ask you to be my golf partner next weekend, but I don't think so. I'm sorry, I just don't think so. Alinda, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah.
Imagination, games, and optimism.
Yeah, definitely. One of the most famous definitions of gameplay is actually the Bernard suits. I think that's what you're referencing. The voluntary overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. And of course, the obstacles we're facing are all very necessary at this point, but we can fool you into thinking that you can have fun while doing it. But I think... there's a person, Rob McDougall, who's a historian who tries to teach history through games, and he actually found that when he had students playing games, they didn't learn all that much about history. But as soon as he challenged them to become the designer of a game about history, they learned tremendous amounts through having to organize the process and thinking counterfactually, which historians don't like to do at all. And so I think what Jesse is saying is perhaps the key is that the content creation and the creativity that is enabled will give people a perspective and a feeling of agency over something that is otherwise so daunting.
Thank you. Alex, any kind of final comments here on the panel related to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that another way of looking at a game is a situation where we know who's on our team, what we're trying to achieve, and what's stopping us. And I think that's actually a really useful framework for thinking about the kinds of things we've been discussing today. And, my personal sense is that the more we push on this stuff, the more we push on optimism and play and imagination, the more we're going to find out that the team is everyone, and what we're pushing against is living on a planet with limits. And, we win if we can do that for a very long time.
Great. Thank you. So speaking of living on a planet with limits, I'm limited to the amount of time allotted for the panel. We've now reached that time. I want to thank each of the panel members for being here today to share with us their thoughts. I wonder if you'd be willing to join me in a round of applause for my fellow panel members. Thank you. And I'll just say before I hand it over to Claudia, again, as I began, for someone that grew up in this area, that came here as a child, that then later in life with my own children came here, and I've attended the speaker series, to think that I'm actually up here at the table today and participating in this panel is just wonderful. And my kids are anxious. They've already been texting me already. How did it go, Dad? So I'll let them know, but I'll then hand things now back over to Claudia. Thank you, Claudia.